If you can't establish proof of your last place of residence, then what is there to say that there are electors who are, for example, randomly selecting ridings, strategically selecting ridings for any number of reasons?
If the Canada Elections Act requires voters voting abroad to vote at their last place of residence, where then does the grandchild or great-grandchild of a Canadian born abroad vote?
Can't we consider electronic voting? We talked about postal voting, but do you know if this is done successfully in other jurisdictions?
It all comes down to trust, right, in the voters and in our democracy. So interesting enough, I just pulled up the latest results from the last election in my own riding, and according to the Elections Canada list that was provided, or according to their own results, there was only 224 voters listed as special ballot or outside of Canada to vote. However, 536 voted.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Order. Welcome to meeting number 12 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Pursuant to Standing Order 108 Sub 3, the committee is meeting on its study of challenges regarding special ballot voting. I would like to now welcome our witnesses for today's meeting. Lucia Kovačíková, Assistant Professor of Political Science, and Professor Laurie Turnbull, Faculty of Management, and again, I'm so sorry, it just seems so weird to say, Dalhousie University. Welcome.
Professor Turnbull, I'll turn it to you. You cited some logistical challenges with regards to special ballot voting for Canadians living abroad. I would submit that there may be another issue, which is a gap, and I'd be interested in your thoughts as it pertains to the application process. The riding in which a Canadian living abroad votes in is determined based on their last address before leaving Canada. Now, the application for registration for Canadians living abroad requires proof of identity to establish Canadian citizenship, but nowhere in the application does it require a prospective elector to provide proof of their last place of residence in Canada. Would you agree that the application process should be amended to require some form of proof of the last place of residence?
I mean, I don't know why it wouldn't. I don't see how that would make it any... I'm just thinking, would it make it any more difficult? Because the value is you want to make sure that Canadian citizens can vote. And you don't want to do anything that would make it more difficult for someone who's eligible to get access to the ballot. So if someone had recently moved outside the country, they might have, readily available proof of where they last lived in Canada. But if they had moved a while ago, it might be harder for them to find that. If it was a student living with parents, they wouldn't have a deed with their name on the house, so they might have to prove for, what would they provide in terms of proof to show that they lived in Canada if there were no bills in their name, that sort of thing. I think we'd have to think through the logistics to make sure that nobody was denied the right. But apart from that, I don't see why we wouldn't require proof.
Yeah, and I certainly take your point about the fact that there could be some challenges for those Canadians who may not have lived in Canada for some time, but every elector living in Canada, voting in Canada, has to provide one piece of ID with their address, or two pieces of ID with at least one of those showing their address, or have someone vouching for them who must establish their address. So there seems to be a bit of inconsistency there, and I guess if you can't establish proof of your last place of residence, then what is there to say that there are electors who are, for example, randomly selecting ridings, strategically selecting ridings for any number of reasons? I mean, it would seem to me that that is a gap. There needs to be some sort of verification, because by law, it's not as if a Canadian living abroad can vote in any riding. By law, they can only vote in the riding that they last had residence in.
Right, I agree with you. It seems like it's sort of matching the requirements that would apply to someone who lives in Canada and making it basically the same for someone who lives outside. I remember it being part of the discussion, is kind of part of the public discussion, 10 years ago when this was going through the court system, and maybe maybe fewer years than that, and people talking about where would expats vote. And it wasn't necessarily obvious. And I remember it coming up, right? Like, what if everybody just wants to vote in Prime Minister Trudeau's riding because they know his name and they want to go and cast a ballot for him? So there were those policy discussions of what's the appropriate place to cast a ballot, especially if you haven't lived here for a long time. So I think you're right. I think I would agree with you.
Thank you for that. Professor Kovasakova, I hope I got that right. Is it correct that over the past 20 years there has been a significant increase in voter participation by Canadians living abroad?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, in terms of actual numbers, more Canadians abroad do vote in federal elections. I'm sure that the 2019 Supreme Court ruling has quite a bit to do with that as well. But in terms of the percentage of the people who request the ballot and actually cast it, the percentage has slowly gone down. So I believe that in 2015, the percentage of people who requested a ballot and then actually cast the vote from abroad was 69%. That percentage has slowly gone down to, I believe, 52 by 2025.
Yeah, but it has significantly gone up from 2004, where I thought there was something in the order of 7,000 or 9,000 ballots cast, and it was in the order of tens of thousands before the Supreme Court decision.
Yes, I believe in 2004 the number was around 10,000, like 9,000 plus. But of course, we have to account for the fact that the number of Canadians living abroad is growing. And so over time, of course, we have seen more and more Canadians vote. But if you look at, the final number from the last election, which is 57,000 Canadians, it really depends on how you look at that. That number could be quite small when you look at the fact that over 4 million Canadians live abroad, right? And so it really depends on what you compare it to. Certainly, in terms of external votes cast by other nationals, Canadians from abroad vote less than, for example, those from the United States.
Thank you so much.
We did talk about this election. You did mail in your ballot, and you got it a little bit late, and then used a private courier that would make sure that your ballot arrives on time. Can you, if you are able to, share the associated costs to you doing that?
Yes. So I really wanted to make sure that it would get back to Canada overnight, and that was, of course, my personal choice. But the time was running out for the deadline. The deadline was fast approaching, and so I spent $120 to send my ballot. Yes.
Yeah. Do you think there's an appetite from Canadians abroad to be able to, go the extra lengths to make sure that their ballot arrives on time? And maybe if I can get Mrs. Turnbull as well on this. What reforms do you think need to be in place to ensure that ballots can actually return on time without an extra associated cost to it? I'll start with you, Mrs. Kovasakova, and then we'll go to Turnbull as well after.
Yes, my name is very long. Sorry about that, everyone. I believe that there is a relatively easy fix, and I think Dr. Turnbull also mentioned, there are certain time constraints that are put in place at the moment, and for example, if there was a way, as is the case with U.S. citizens who vote from abroad, to be able to print out a ballot and send it, for example, that would significantly reduce the amount of time that it would need to spend, going through the postal service both there and back. Do I think there is an appetite from Canadians living abroad to pay an additional cost to cast their ballot? I would say it really depends on the individual. I cannot imagine that there would be a lot of people who would be willing to pay $120 to cast a ballot. I am a political science professor, so I feel like I'm a very special case that I think it's very important for me to cast the ballot. But then again, I do want to very quickly mention the issue that, some ridings, because we have a first past the post system, some ridings are simply, pretty easy to determine where they would go. And I myself happen to be voting in a riding that is pretty much decided. And so there is a question of whether my vote even matters, right? Because if we know how the riding's going to go, then perhaps I didn't have to spend $120, but it is my personal choice to do so. But in a case of other Canadians who are seeing this, and they see the polling and they know that their riding is going to go one way or the other, they might not feel the need to even cast the ballot, right? It might be sort of prohibitive for them when they know that they might even have to pay additional costs to get it there on time.
Thank you. Dr. Turnbull, on reforms that you think would aid in this situation, whereas obviously the voter turnout for Canadians abroad is low, how could we encourage them to vote more?
I think one thing we could think about doing is, instead of having the requirement that we have the vote received on election day, we could think about making sure that it is, sent by and posted, stamped by election day. There's a Supreme Court case going on in the U.S. right now to that effect, because the states, of course, make their own laws about this, and so some states will allow a ballot that comes in late, and then some states won't. And so we're not the only ones with this issue, and it applies. The same type of thing would apply to someone who lives in Canada and who didn't get their vote in on time too. We could think about that, a little bit of a grace period after Election Day, just to make sure that the costs, for example, could be defrayed in the event, so that you didn't have to make extra steps and extra costs to make sure you got your vote there on time.
Thank you. And what would you explain is the reason as to why only 100,000 of the estimated 3 million Canadian voters that requested the ballot in 2025 general election was returned? Like, only 100,000 were returned out of 3 million that were requested. What do you think is the reason?
Well, I mean, it's probably a number of things. It's hard sometimes for people who are not right in the middle of it, and they're not absorbing and receiving communications about the election all the time. Like when we're for me anyway, when we're in Canada, we're in election time, that's taking over. There's coverage every day. We're really focused on it. If you're living elsewhere, you're not going to get the same exposure to it. You're not going to get the same reminders. You're certainly not going to get the same exposure to the candidates in your riding and the specific ways that it's playing out in the riding that you'd vote, because you're not living in that community. And if you do kind of look at the writing on the wall and think my vote is probably not going to make a difference in the riding, the same types of things, honestly, that could deter a Canadian living in Canada from voting could apply to the international context too, in the sense that you might not feel that sense that you're going to make a difference.
As you probably know, the House of Commons recently passed an immigration bill to deal with a Supreme Court ruling that says the first generation limit is now not in effect for Canadians born abroad, or the children of Canadians born abroad. And so my question is, if the Canada Elections Act requires voters voting abroad to vote at their last place of residence, where then does the grandchild or great-grandchild of a Canadian born abroad vote? Because they have likely never been at the residence that is listed and required by their grandparent or great-grandparent, who's the last person in their family to have lived in this country. How then do we determine where those folks vote, or are designating their Canadian citizens now by act of Parliament? It's going to pass the Senate, I'm sure, and will be in effect. And so how then do we determine what constituency those multi-generation foreign-born Canadians, where do they vote? Dr. Turnbull first, maybe, and then Professor Kavasakova.
Okay, so I think if we are like going back to an earlier exchange, I can remember this question coming up when the court case was ongoing and government was considering this, and there being a back and forth about where Canadians abroad would cast their ballot. And I believe that when the decision was made that they would cast the ballot in the last riding that they lived in, that has it has the advantage of being clear. You're not making a judgment. You're not asking people to say, what's your favorite riding? Where do you feel the closest affinity? You're not doing that. You're saying, what is the fact-based, just to eliminate any possibility of people trying to make judgments about where they ought to be voting and there being inconsistencies in the application of the accessibility to the ballot. And so I feel like if we've taken that choice in terms of deciding where people will vote, it puts us in a difficult spot for a Canadian citizen who has in fact never lived in a riding in Canada. There's no, I would love to give you a clear answer to this, but I think we're seeing a limitation of that, of the value that we chose to emphasize, it being that clarity and the attachment to the last riding. You might have lived there for 2 weeks.
Right.
And spent your whole life somewhere else.
Yeah.
I am a Cape Bretoner at heart. I will be forever. But if I moved away,
Yeah.
I'd have to vote in Ottawa, right? Like I'd have to vote in this riding. So, I think that there is a maybe a policy gap is the right word. Like it's not easy to take that principle and then apply it to someone who is a Canadian citizen but who has never lived here.
Dr. Vasakova?
No, I agree. This is a great question, and I agree with Dr. Turnbull that there isn't an easy explanation. But I think, starting to think creatively about this, this is where the potential conversation might come in about MPs that are designated for overseas voters, for example. I know that was part of the debate during the last committee meeting with the previous two witnesses. But I do think that it will require sort of outside the box thinking, because I don't think that it makes much sense to tie those people to the old riding in which their sort of family used to reside a generation ago. So I do think that there will need to be a sort of a different approach.
I'm glad you mentioned the committee testimony from the last meeting, because I'm also curious about our dear friends down the street. And by that, I mean the conversation here is about equal representation for foreign living abroad Canadians. And so we're talking a lot about the House of Commons and elections, but nobody's mentioned the Senate. And so I'm fascinated to know what equal representation in the upper chamber may look like as part of this conversation. Are we now asking the government to appoint senators to represent Canadians who live abroad, or are we only worried about equal representation for Canadians in the House of Commons who live abroad? Anybody can take that.
I'll jump in. This is a fascinating angle and a fascinating lens on the discussion, because it's how we apply the values and the principles that we want, that we believe are important and we know are important, and how do we actually operationalize that? It's much harder in a lot of ways, right, to think about how you're going to put this in practice. And so even for things like, even representation in the House of Commons, if we started to think along these lines of what if Canadians living abroad had their own representative, how would that work in terms of the constitutional formula around representation by population and ensuring that there's a kind of there's a balance in a riding, right? We protect communities of interest. We have a geographical sense of how big we want a riding to be and how many people we want to be in that riding. Well, an MP for Canadians living abroad would be a totally different kettle of fish. I'm not sure how we would make that work constitutionally anyway. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying we don't have a formula for that right now at all. And I find sometimes in these conversations, there is a tendency to say, okay, we'll do a senator for that. Because it's just like, that might be easier, but it wouldn't be, because the allocation of senators is by province and by region. And so this would be an extremely complex thing to do, and it would definitely have constitutional implications.
That was my next question,
Oh, yeah.
actually, so thank you.
Mr. Jackson.
Sorry.
Sorry, over time. But,
Yeah, that's okay.
We can continue on that conversation.
In your best estimate, say what kind of percentages of people just don't want to vote, people don't have the information knowing how to vote, or people are trying and can't vote? What would your best idea of a breakdown be?
Honestly, you could probably apply the same categories to Canadians living in Canada and say that we don't have great voter turnout, and there have been years that we've been really worried about it. And I was trying to memorize your categories as you said them so that I would be able to come up with some kind of intelligent answer to your question. But when we started studying this stuff really in depth back in 2000, when voter turnout was something like 62% in a federal election, those sorts of categories emerged, right? There are people who could not vote for administrative, for whatever reason it operationally didn't happen, even though they wanted to. And then there were some people who didn't like any of the choices, didn't want to vote for anyone. And then there were, people who were totally turned off of the process, were just not interested in it at all. So you had this kind of divide between those who purposely didn't vote, between the ones who engaged but didn't like the choices, and then some who just didn't engage at all. And so the worry, I think, was more the ones who just self-selected out of the whole process. And there are lots of debates to be had about how big a problem the decline of voter turnout is. How bad is it? Should we really be worried about this? When we see provincial elections with fewer than 50% of eligible voters voting, to me, that's a major problem. What do we expect in terms of a voter turnout for Canadians living abroad? I would anticipate it would be less than the overall turnout for people living here, because you don't have the parties reaching out to you as much. I don't think, anyway. Do political parties have lists of Canadians living abroad? And are those lists as up to date as the ones that you have for Canadians living here? I'd be interested in the data on how many Canadians living abroad give donations to political parties. Do they show other ways of getting engaged in the process? And I think it probably has a lot to do with how much you're staying informed with this sort of thing. It would be a very individual kind of calculation. So the answer to your question, the long one, I'm sorry, is I don't know. I think it's really hard to know, for a group, for people living anywhere in the world who are Canadian citizens. They could have all kinds of reasons for not voting. But if we want to identify low voter turnout among Canadians living abroad as a problem, B, something we want to do something about, I think political parties would have to take a leadership role in getting really engaged in that.
Can't we consider electronic voting? We talked about postal voting, but do you know if this is done successfully in other jurisdictions? Could it facilitate the whole matter and settle the question of delays? Ms. Turnbull and then Ms.
What if we opened up electronic voting just across the board? We make it possible to vote in general elections by digitally.
My question is for expatriates.
I think once you open the possibility, if we were to open the possibility of voting electronically, I think it would be very, very difficult to make an argument that would only apply to some voters, that it would only apply to voters living abroad, because lots of people would love to be able to vote electronically. And personally, I would love to see a movement in that direction. I think it would do a whole lot of good to break down barriers for people with physical disabilities, people who are living in remote communities, people who actually do have to go through quite significant expenditure to be able to vote, even though they do live in Canada and they're trying to get to their polling station. So I'm in favor of giving more thought to electronic voting. I don't think that we would be able to restrict it to people living abroad. I don't think we should either.
Can't speak for all the committee members here. I am somebody, though, that has voted by special ballot, because in the Canadian Armed Forces, it is actually set up fairly well. I've had the privilege of voting, I think, in Bosnia and in Afghanistan, and our votes have got back here. At least we're assuming that they get back. So, but there is, to speak just to that process, I know every member of the CAF is registered as their home riding. They can change that if they get posted, but there's a deliberate process, so there's a record. Where I'm going with this, and I want to kind of go back and build on some of the other questions, is it all comes down to trust, right, in the voters and in our democracy. So interesting enough, I just pulled up the latest results from the last election in my own riding, and according to the Elections Canada list that was provided, or according to their own results, there was only 224 voters listed as special ballot or outside of Canada to vote. However, 536 voted. So you get into a question, there was only 224 on the list, and when I look at the latest data that we all get as members of Parliament, we can pull from Elections Canada, there's only 164 still on that list. So when you have this vast number, so it just raises some fascinating conversations, and I think analysis or research that should be dug into, because if you're saying voters abroad, Canadians abroad aren't voting on mass numbers yet, in my own riding, twice as many people are voting than actually are on the list. So it gets to this question of what are MPs, or not MPs, I should say candidates, because part of our whole democratic process here in Canada is our ability to make our case to why we should be the best representative, the candidate for the respective ridings that are running. So I just, any commentary from both you, Dr. Turnbull, or you, Professor, would be just great on this whole, the interesting challenges here about maintaining trust, but at the same time ensuring that that information flows both ways so that voters can make informed decisions on how they vote, and at the same time how political parties and candidates can actually engage in the process.
Yes, it doesn't help public trust if a discrepancy like that happens. Like, if I'm understanding you correctly, there were X number of 200 and some people on the list who were eligible to vote abroad? Okay, and then there were twice as many of that people that voted by special ballot. So is it that some of those people voted by special ballot who live in Canada?
Great question. Elections Canada doesn't provide us that at the, fidelity. They maybe do on election night or whatever if we dug into the actual list, but I can't tell you right now.
I think one of the things that has come from the 2025 example, where we have this information that I think is 822 special ballots were in the wrong place, weren't counted at the right time, and that sort of thing can create real concern on the part of voters to the extent that they become aware of it. That what if votes aren't counted? What if this process isn't unfolding as it should? I think we really pride ourselves in Canada on and I think we should, on having a very strong electoral democracy, that the administration is nonpartisan, it's independent, it's run extremely well. And so I'm interested in the reaction that Elections Canada has, because when they say when they say we're going to make sure this was human error, this is not going to happen again, I wonder what the process is going to be. Yeah.
Go ahead, Professor.
Yes, thank you. It's a great question, and I fully agree. One thing that I myself noticed, I was looking up some numbers prior to our meeting, and I wanted to find out the number of special ballot votes in the last election. And the interesting thing is that this is perhaps a very boring thing to mention, but the methodology of how you count these things matters. And so sometimes there's some data out there that actually measure voters from overseas that exclude the military. And sometimes you find data that includes the overseas military as well as other overseas voters. And obviously that makes a big difference, right? To be able to separate those two groups or to count them together. And so this is just one example of when I myself was trying to find certain data and I realized that, I can't use this particular statistic because this includes both the military and other voters, but this other one includes only one of the two groups. And my larger point here is that it would be really great if those that kind of data, more sort of specialized data, was actually made public, so that we would actually know what the differences in the groups were. Because obviously, once you include the military and diplomats, that changes how you can actually use that data and what you are actually counting.
Yeah, in 30 seconds I have left, so just a quick question to both of you. Is there another country out there that's really kind of cracked this problem, that does it better than Canada does? Is just the name of the country that maybe has done a better job?
To Estonia, they're great at everything. They're much smaller though. So how do we take that and like scale what they do? But like in terms of using electronic voting, like being tighter with those sorts of things, Estonia is always the example I hear.
You know, what are the things that we could do to try to make it easier for folks to vote? I mean, we used the example, I think, in one of the earlier sessions of it takes a week to get to Hong Kong, it takes a week to get back, there's all the process of registering. But I mean, if you think about people who are living, Canadians who are living in Nepal, that's much worse than Hong Kong. And so it just seems to me that having only one mechanism that clearly is pretty clunky is not a way to encourage participation. So maybe I just throw all of that to both of you.
I'll try to take a little piece of it and not take too much time. I don't think anybody would put their hand up and say mail is the best, most efficient, quick way to do anything, right? Like, I mean, at this point, we're used to being able to do everything online. I think that there's an argument to be made that we should think about that. The question is the security of it. How do you ensure that this is going to be a safe transaction? I'm not a digital tech person. There are people out there who can answer that question. But I think in terms of trying to verify the identity of the person, the security of the vote, those sorts of things would make it a lot easier. And I think beyond that, we can make some changes to the system we have now. One thing is that we don't have fixed elections here, right? Like in the US, they know when their elections are coming. Presidential systems they're in a whole different situation. Sometimes I feel like we're having elections all the time, but we don't. And it's much harder, I think, for us in a parliamentary system to fully engage that process when we have to wait till the writ drops in order to be able to take any real action.
Yes, I would fully agree with that. I do think that in terms of the academic literature, I honestly cannot really point to anything that I know that specifically deals with comparing Canada to other systems and trying to compare the statistics on voter turnout from abroad. So certainly a big space there to be filled, and it would be wonderful to have some new data. But in terms of sort of why the turnout was so low, I would say that exactly the parliamentary system is part of it, right? The fact that it is in many ways the beauty of the system that elections can be called relatively quickly. But what that essentially means, especially voting by post, is that you may not receive the ballot in time to then mail it back. Mine was an example of that, where I tried very hard to get it there overnight, but whether it arrived or not is another story. And I think that quick turnaround also increases the incidence of not getting timely information about elections. So you may know that, I'm in a different position because I pay attention, right? But if I was a Canadian who wasn't in the political space, and I know that there is a talk about election, but I'm not really sure when it's happening. And then all of a sudden it's called. And by the time I look up from my day-to-day life, I realize it's over. So if you have these quick turnarounds, that's great in many other respects. But in terms of actually sort of having the administrative ability to tell everybody, especially those abroad, and to then mail the ballots back and forth, that really creates a huge challenge.